Well, first of all, thank you so much to everyone at the museum who's been involved in putting this together, especially Rachel, the curator. And thank you for the intro, Lane, and to everyone for being here. Um, so, for the talk, I'm going to be taking you through about mostly the last 4 to 5 years of my work, but I'm also going to be talking a little bit about the history of weaving and my influences, and also showing you a few earlier pieces because I feel like they contextualize where I've gone since then. Um, I love this quote by Susan Kerr, who we're going to meet in the next slide. The way that she's talking about how things like mosaics and needlepoint, or in my case, weaving, relates to the screen is this really crucial part of my work. She is responsible for designing things like the trash can that you see on your desktops and things like that. And she used needlepoint to kind of, well, she's a needlepoint artist and started off these designs through this grid-based um, process. I love it because I feel like you can see how it was back then when computers were new and it was this new thing that people were able to explore. I've always been really drawn to like the early internet. I was a kid in the 90s growing up with this early internet before we really knew how to use it, and I feel like back then it was so playful and uninhibited and weird, and now, it's so we use the same vibe websites and it's become this really homogenous thing. So I went to RISD for textiles, and I was very lucky to be able to work on this huge jacquard loom, which is a computer operated loom. So this is different than what I do now, except for the Google pieces if you saw the show. So this kind of loom, you're using this weave software to program the different structures to create the image. And I feel like this was kind of the first time that I really realized this relationship between the digital and weaving. Just working on this loom and being present when things were getting woven, it felt like a big computer and the way that it moves. And as you see, basically these pixels come together. It was really interesting. So it's funny to show because this is actually something I made in undergrad, but I like to show it because I feel like it's just kind of where my work ended up going. Looking at digital culture and how we communicate. A lot of you probably don't know about AOL Instant Messenger, but it was this pre-texting platform where people would, use it to talk to their friends. And I just was really interested in kind of all of these different slang and abbreviations that developed, all of these languages that came through these platforms. So these three images I think are cool to see side by side. That's a very early jacquard punch card. So probably around the 1800s, that punch card or that image is from. And then there's an early computer punch card and also a weave draft. So a weave draft is essentially this language that you use to put together all of these things in a loom to make an image. So the top and right grids are all of these different instructions to set up the loom, and then it will make that central image. So it's essentially a computer. You're putting together these different sets of instructions to enable a computer to do a certain task. So this is kind of like the backbone of my work. It's always there. I'm a tapestry weaver, which I'll get into. It's a little bit different, but I'm really interested in that kind of the relationship between this very old tool that's been around for 12,000 years or so, and how it's so tied to this thing that is newer. So this picture too is helpful to see because on a loom you're working with vertical threads and horizontal threads. So the EPI, which is warp ends per inch, so it's like how many strings are in an inch. The more there are, the higher the resolution is. So for me, I use really low EPI. So if you look at the tapestries, there's always going to be this pixelation. And I try to work with that. I try to heighten that. I think this is really interesting, just how there's this linguistic relationship between the two, internet, World Wide Web. This book weaving the web. I feel like tapestry and weaving always get used by people in conversations as a way to talk about connectivity. I used to write it down on my phone, and because I just noticed it being used so much. Very quickly, I'll touch on this, just the gender aspect of weaving. It's always been seen as women's work. And when you look at like how it's been perceived within the contemporary art world, and I mean, the history, like way back into ancient Egypt, you can see these pictures of women weaving, and obviously that has influenced how it's been kind of overlooked. And then when you look at the history of computing, and it's of course kind of seen as this more masculine medium, yet women have always been a part of its initial and current developments. So finally, get back to my work. After school, I just started weaving on these frames because I didn't have a loom. And that's the first time that I started weaving tapestry, which is a lot different than what I was explaining before with using a weave draft. Tapestry is kind of more like you're drawing on the loom. So eventually I got this loom that I still use today, and I made some of the pieces in the show on this. You can see me working. Just to explain tapestry a little bit, so you hopefully maybe understand how it works. I feel like it's always hard to explain, but you can see that diagram with the warps and the wefts. So your warps are your vertical strings and your wefts are your horizontals. And with tapestry, unlike structure-based weaving, you're manually placing the yarns into different arrangements. So you're not working from edge to edge. You're building up shapes kind of like within the confines of that space. So it's a process of working from the bottom up. It's much slower than weaving with structure because you're not working edge to edge. It slows the process down, but there's more of a hand, and I feel like I gravitated towards it because I have more control. I can use any colors I want, and now that I've been doing it for 15 years, I feel like I can weave anything I want. There's not really any limitations. Whereas, like, if I were to use a jacquard loom, there's this different materiality to it. It has more of a uniformity to it. So I hate to use this word, but it kind of feels more painterly because I have more control over what I can do. So my early tapestries were still looking at the screen, but it was really pared down, kind of like thinking about all the shapes and forms that make up the screen, user interface design, and all of these, the ways that our eyes kind of gravitate towards different images on the screen. Skeuomorphic design is something that I always think about. Susan Kare used this in her strategy of design. So it's like this idea of taking something from the real world and putting it on the screen to represent the same thing. With my tapestries, I am always screenshotting, and I'm taking pictures of things that I see in the real world too. And those things I put in Photoshop and turn them into PNGs and make my images. So often I feel like what happens is like there is a blurred line between these things. Like sometimes there will be an image I find when I'm walking around in LA and that gets put into the tapestry, but it also kind of feels like this digital emblem. And I'm always thinking about this too. I feel like Susan Kare's work influenced the development of emojis and how we think about using these images to communicate things without words. It's, I feel like for me, been really interesting to kind of see how emojis have evolved over time too. And even things like, people that have Androids, the emojis are slightly different than what they are on iPhones, and how that slight difference can really change the way an image communicates. So I'm moving forward a few years. A lot changed for me and I think the world. In between that time, I moved down to California for grad school, and Trump got elected, and the world felt really different suddenly. And 2 months after I moved to California, I had to evacuate because it was the largest wildfire in California history hit. It's since been surpassed by many other fires. But I feel like I had this really visceral kind of association with climate change. And I think for a long time I had been wanting to touch on that and try to make work about it, but it seemed like a really tricky thing to navigate. So this quote, Metahaven is this Dutch design collective that does really interesting work. They wrote this book, and I love it, especially for the ending part. Let's show them our deepest cat-like instincts. So I liked with most of my work, I'm not really using human figures. I guess the show is starting to do that, but I wanted to kind of take the viewer out of the human perspective and look at this issue from the perspective of an animal. And cats, they're so close to us. They're domesticated. They're also this viral force in the internet. We, I think, always associate cats with the internet. And they have this, fiery disposition, and they are honest and say how they feel or say what they think. And they just felt like the right animal to use. So I started putting them into these spaces, these landscapes of destruction, and pairing the titles with Lolcat Speak. So the titles really bring you into that digital space, I think. But these ones were fun too because I wasn't using as much appropriation. Like all the cats were things that I would draw, creating all their different personalities and expressions. Just threw this in here because this was a few years later, but I made this, I call them tapestry murals. So it's like a painted mural, and then I shape the tapestries on the loom. They're kind of like cutouts, and they get put into the same space. It was a lot of fun. So this one, you can see the drawing behind those warps there. That's the tapestry cartoon. So I make these digital collages, blow them up to scale and with pencil, and then they get placed behind the warp. So it's like this guide. This one too, you can also see how distorted and striated and pixelized that background color gets. So I dye a lot of my yarn by hand. I dip skeins, which are like loops of yarn, into dye at different moments so that the colors are shifting. So then when I weave them, it kind of naturally becomes this pixelated backdrop. This one too, I think is important because the chaotic line that comes into my work a lot now, it's the first time I used it. In this context, it was like literally representing a storm, but now that line I see as this kind of this chaos line. At this point, it's just kind of part of my visual language, and it's always in the background and kind of adding to the anxiety and chaos in the pieces. So this is a show that I had with that work. This little die pick. And this is I have a home studio right now in LA, which I really enjoy. My cats work alongside me. This little cat, she's really funny. The harnesses on the loom move up and down, and she just lays like that and uses it as a back massage. Okay, so another big shift in the work. At this point, the pandemic hit, and I already had been thinking a lot about these wavy inflatable people. And I mean, they're really prevalent in LA because it's a city that's so tied to car culture, and these are in front of gas stations and things like that. And they're so funny and wacky, and also kind of, they have this empty stare that is really strange to me. GIF was circulating a lot during early pandemic days, and I feel like it's so well represented what we were all feeling. And of course, my work focuses a lot on kind of how we communicate through our screens. So I really wanted to make work about Zoom meetings. This is me and my family Zooming, my grandma with her face shield. um, so I did this series where I took us out of it. The tube of people become us, and they're in these various Zoom scenarios. So this one you can see like that iconic palm tree green screen is in it, along with some other images like fire, which I use a lot in my work, the upside down flag, which I screenshotted in this live feed of one of the George Floyd protests. And I did a bunch that were just, playing with that grid too. This one, of course, is like from a more humorous perspective. One of my favorite meme accounts, Aborted Dreams. I feel like this is just an artist statement for this series, really. So that's one of the digital collages, and I just wanted to show that so you could kind of see what they look like before they get woven. And this is the motif library. So there's a lot of symbols that I like continuously pull from, like the cones, for example. I've just used those a lot, but other ones get used once, and I'm kind of always collecting this imagery and building this library that I can pull from. So this piece in particular, I was thinking just about what it was like to live in LA during the pandemic. Dodger Stadium has this huge parking lot that was turned into a testing site, and eventually it's like where I got vaccinated too. So there's like this cone landscape you had to drive through, and that symbol of the mouth was on this big screen, and you drive up to the mouth and get instructed on how to take a test. So like this piece is pulling a lot of symbols like that from just, the place that I live in, and kind of trying to represent the anxiety of that moment. A big part of my work too is tied to the way that tapestry has always been used in a narrative sense, as a way to communicate and store information and document culture. So I do think about my work kind of as this archive. Digital images and languages change so quickly, and I think there's something interesting about taking this really slow medium and slowing these things down that are on our screen that are so fast and ephemeral. So yeah, some of these pieces were in this show in Copenhagen. This is a piece I'm very fond of. I made it after I experienced this spontaneous dance party after Trump lost the election. So continuing to work with those tubes, but I mean, I think like just the juxtaposition of the gas station and the party felt like just this very LA moment. And it was such a moment of collective joy. This piece came from that. So humor is a really big part of my work. I think that humor is so powerful. I feel like when you think about contemporary art, a lot of the time it's like it has to be serious, right? But I think humor is just this really great tool to kind of talk about those serious things in a way that makes it a little more easier to process. And just like a meme, which obviously, if you see it in the show, my work focuses on that a lot. And that mix of comedy and tragedy can do so much. So my favorite pandemic moment was this situation with these lawyers in an actual court session on Zoom, and one of them accidentally had this cat filter in his face. And also just, pets being in the Zoom frame was such this thing at that moment, so I knew I had to make a piece about that. So at this point, I got offered this show in Taiwan, which was really exciting, and went back to the cats. There's actually this cute cat theory of digital activism that this media scholar, Ethan Zuckerman, wrote, and it's really tied to internet censorship. So he's essentially saying that it's going to be easier for activists to use things like Facebook and Twitter to get their message across, which I feel like when you look at the last 10 years or so, that's so true. Like without Instagram and these things, like how would some of these social movements have gotten to the point that they have? But at the same time, I feel like there's, of course, holes in this theory. And I think, what was it, like 2 weeks ago, Instagram added that censored political content feature. And yeah, it's an interesting one to look into and see kind of how things change. But a lot of the work in the show was still working with the cats, but putting them more into the screen. The way that I make these compositions, like in my head, there's this connection and story between all the symbols. I feel like when it comes down to it, my work is really about semiotics and just like what symbols mean and how, when they're placed together, they can create meaning. So I started using a lot of Spotify symbols or screenshots of different songs playing on Spotify to kind of guide the work and add or provide a narrative. So this one is using this Brian Eno song, Spinning Away, that has some text included in that. The little globes I found from these climate protests and put them in the Zoom frame. And then there's a lot of just little Easter eggs. Like, I mean, maybe some of you've heard of this moment with the ha-ha-has, but it was this little moment, right, that maybe went viral at that point. But I like the idea of like putting in these almost secrets or Easter eggs into the pieces that tell stories. So, Hang in There, Baby. This was a really popular poster in the 70s that this photographer made. It got so popular that it got copied, and he filed all these lawsuits against people because they were selling their own posters. So it really was kind of like an early meme. And I think the quote and the message tied into the series. And I like the idea that like there's a lot of different artists that are interpreting this poster and making their own versions, their own memes. So I had to do this. Such a prevalent meme, but to me, these cats are going through something and they're like going through an existential crisis. So I did a whole series, some of which were included in the show, of the bread cats. What's more uncomfortable than a cat with bread on its face, I guess. So it was really interesting to show in Taiwan too, because I think like memes and digital culture are so, like it's very easy to not understand a meme if you don't understand its context. So to show in this different country that has a very different culture than the US, like I think a lot of the references weren't understood by people that I talked to at the show. But when we would talk about the work, there was still ways to connect on it. I was shown a lot of memes by people, like Taiwanese memes. And yeah, it's an interesting thing that the context of a meme and how the context really is important to understanding the joke. So this body of work, I think was a the work that I made. I think there's a lot of changes. Like I, on a technical level, started pushing myself to figure out how to weave photographic images, which, along with the text, started opening up some ways for me to reference these things that we see on our screens. I mean, and with memes, that's so important because usually text is a part of it. I think it's important to mention Richard Dawkins, who was a biologist who actually coined the term meme. So, memes predate the digital. Digital memes are a new evolution, but his idea of a meme, like the "Hang in There, Baby" poster, for example, that was for sure a meme. And this piece that's in the show, I think is interesting to look at in the context also of what I was talking about kind of in the earlier part of the talk, looking at the early internet and how it was such a different space. So it was like this space where people were exploring and messing with it and almost using it more like a game, I feel like. And now we're just all scrolling and taking in content and getting anxious and depressed. So yeah, I feel like if you think about that piece and a lot of the work that I make, I feel like I'm almost creating my own memes because I'm like recontextualizing the meme and putting it into this new environment. Like a meme, it's remixed and it's appropriated and remixed and altered to create different variations of the same thing that can mean different things. So this is one of my tapestry cartoons, so just wanted to show it so you can maybe get a better idea of how it works. I make these pencil drawings, and those get put behind the warps, and then from there, like, I think where I play with the work is the material and the colors. So I mean, for example, like the piece that's in the show with the Elmo, that was like this special moment where I had this red mohair yarn, and it was like the perfect moment to use that material because Elmo is fuzzy. I mean, I could use that material to kind of heighten it. I like finding those purposeful reasons to use material. So this is a great book. I love what she's saying about how internet memes can be seen as postmodern folklore. I think memes say so much about the moment that we're living in, and I'm so interested in like what's going to happen 20, 30 years from now when we look back at these memes that are so prevalent in the moment and how much we will remember or what they will mean then. Um, so a lot of the work in the show I approached thematically, like not necessarily in terms of doom scrolling, but what we do when we're not doom scrolling, how we avoid the doom scroll. For anyone who's used dating apps, I know that you probably know that they can be like this addicting thing where you're just scrolling even though you're not even really looking, or maybe you are, but you pick up your phone and you just, click through it. And I think we do that with a lot of apps, but I liked the idea of investigating that with the work. And I mean, this piece, there's all of these different buttons from the apps. It's Match, it's from Tinder, and in the context of this piece, the ghost emoji becomes something really specific, like in relation to ghosting. And this moment, I think, is putting LA into it, like my experience of living in LA. There was this show at Mocha, and it was one of those shows where like the entire city was covered with those like flags advertising the show, and they used this image. And I mean, if you haven't listened to Pavarotti Risk's cover of this song, it's really good, and I feel like it's just it pairs well with thinking about dating apps more as a hellscape, like negative look at dating apps. And at this point, I was bringing in some memes that, for me, were more of a challenge and like in order to weave. So I'm sure a lot of you know affirmations. It's a popular one. I think it's so good. It's also interesting because I feel like it's looking back at like the earlier meme style with like using that big text, but the way that it's styled and paired and this kind of like ironic negative look at the reality of our world is so funny, and it's kind of nice to laugh at a reality that is often just depressing. um, Astrology too, I wanted to touch on. I think different apps and our phones have like instilled this new meaning into astrology, and just like how we use it as this crutch, to similar to affirmations. Like, you know, you can get these notifications on your phone that maybe give you a little bit of a laugh, or just like a look into like how you can approach life differently. um, there's also a lot of astrology meme accounts. And this one, I mean, who doesn't use their phone to just like get a little bit happier by looking at animal videos? I knew I had to make a piece about that. And it includes my favorite meme, the, I don't know what you call it, but this meme that matches objects with dogs. It's a brilliant one. So I think that this piece in the show frames the whole show. This is like the one that I see as the doom scroll, along with the one that's called doom scroll. But the central image of the Simpsons meme is one that becomes viral every year and probably will continue to, you know, come back each summer when it gets hot. There's a lot of information in this one, and I like doing that. I like making them really dense to the point that you have to sit with them and explore them, and think about how all the symbols come together to mean something. I think that because of internet addiction, we all have less patience now too, and I mean, it's my hope that these pieces allow you to kind of like slow down and maybe get a little more patient and hopefully sit with them and think about what's going on. So, I mean, yeah, this piece has so much built into it. Like those little explosion symbols I found. I think on New York Times there were like explosions in a map of like the war in Ukraine, and there's just the temperature, your iPhone needs to cool down. I like the idea of putting that into the context of this piece that has this central image of climate change. So there's like ways that the symbols can be put into the piece in a way that I feel like adds dual meaning and dual reference to, like, I guess these things that we are so used to see. At least I'm used to seeing the phone is getting too hot. I don't know if it happens here much, but yeah, like what does it mean to put that in the context of this piece? And a lot of these things are just like things that we're so used to seeing to the point that I feel like we don't even think about them that much, like the low battery symbol, and you know, we have an attachment, an association to them, but I like to kind of, I guess, just allow us to think about them more. Another good account. So this new series was really exciting for me to make. I hadn't worked with jacquard in a long time, which again is like that big loom that I showed in the beginning, which is a big industrial loom. I had this idea in my head for a long time, and I knew that it didn't really make sense to weave them by hand, for one, because it would take forever, but there wasn't anything about like the materiality of the work that would change from weaving them by hand. So I went the jacquard route, and for many months I was screenshotting these drop-down menus, like when you type in what is or what are, and letter, you get this series of drop downs, which I'm sure you all know. But they change depending on where you are and the time. So I like this idea of putting them together and kind of thinking about our collective consciousness and what we're Googling and what that means about the moment. And, some of them are really funny and some of them are more serious. But I feel like for me, like when I read them, it's almost like a poem. There's like a rhythm to them when you read through them. And I like the idea that I could keep making these and like the the year that's tied to the piece kind of is a marker to that moment. And what would one look like in 5 years? What would be the same and what would be different? Because a lot of them are kind of questions that are questions that could be asked at any moment. But I mean, there's some of them that I feel like even just in the past few months have become more interesting. Like, why is the US trying to ban TikTok, for example? Like, I think that's been going on for a while, but more recently it's more in the news. So it's been interesting to see like how they're changing just in a short time. And I blew it. I already showed you this, but that's the end. Thank you for listening.